Deputy Sean Kenny is the next speaker.
Thank you, Lascan Corla. I recall viewing the film The Inconvenient Truth by the United States presidential candidate Al Gore a decade ago, which clearly and scientifically identified the effects of climate change and global warming. The film sparked a great debate on climate change at that particular time. Unfortunately, many interest groups, particularly in the United States, went into denial about the effects of climate change globally at that particular time. And I believe now that a decade has been lost globally in taking worldwide action to deal with the effects of climate change. The Climate Change and Low Carbon Development Bill before us sets out the national objective of transitioning to a low carbon, environmentally sustainable economy in the period up to and including the year 2050. That is a framework to last 35 years, and indeed 35 years is a very long time. That is why this legislation provides for the preparation and approval by the government of national mitigation plans every 5 years, which set out how our national greenhouse gas emissions will be reduced in line with both existing EU legislative requirements and wider international commitments under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I think it is worth noting that each successive national mitigation plan will specify the policy measures that will be required to be adopted by each relevant minister of the government to reduce greenhouse gases emissions in sectors of society for which they are responsible. This will enable the entire government of the day to move in a meaningful way towards the achievement of transitioning to a low-carbon economy. As Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions profile are predominantly made up of emissions from agriculture, transport, energy and the built environment, it is anticipated that it is these sectors that most mitigation effects will be required. In bringing forward this proposed national legislation, Ireland will also contribute and be seen to contribute its fair share of mitigation effort as part of global endeavours under the UNFCCC to limit the rise in average global temperature to no more than 2 degrees above the pre-industrial level. These endeavours, if successful, will globally benefit us all, but particularly developing countries, where lesser capabilities to respond and adapt render them more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The bill also deals with adaptation to climate change in that it provides for the preparation and approval of successive national climate change adaptation frameworks, which will outline the national strategy that will deal with this important issue. On a related note, as the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere rises with historic emissions, adapting to inevitable changes in climate in Ireland, such as increased frequency of severe weather events, becomes critical. It is important to say that severe weather events are not just the heavy storms that seem to sweep in from the Atlantic with increasing frequency in winter, nor is it the warmer weather we seem to be starting to get in recent years. It is events such as localised flooding that have become more of a problem, and in my own constituency of Dublin Bay North, whether it is floods in Dooneycarney or waves flooding the coastline and the coast road at Clontarf, that must also be considered, and must be considered on a local as well as a national basis. In this regard, the National Framework Adaptation Plan will set out those sectors such as flood defence and the protection of communication and electricity infrastructure, which will be required to develop sectoral adaptation plans to prepare for and invest wisely to minimise the likely impacts of a changing climate and extreme weather events. In conclusion, I think it is essential to point out that never in Ireland has specific climate change legislation been enacted, and in enacting such legislation will not be of direct help to this generation, but it will to future generations, and that is what is important when considering climate change as an issue. I support this legislation and I commend the bill to the House. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy.